He's remembered for the tough guy roles that defined his screen persona. But what hardly anyone talks about is how this hard boiled gangster type was also one of Hollywood's most explosive dancers, leaving a permanent mark on how audiences saw dance on film. Hey there, welcome to a new episode of The Rest of the Story, my weekly series on my podcast, Hey Dancer. I'm your host, Miller Duray, and what can I say? I just really appreciate you being here. And a little shout out to my YouTube dance family because we just hit 25,000 subscribers. And I'm very, very, very grateful for the support. This is definitely a milestone for me and my channel and in my voice in dance in general. So thank you. Speaking of subscribers, if you aren't subbed or following, make sure to do so because, yeah, it really helps my mission to spread the stories of these dance legends, you know? The world needs to know. Anyway, while you're at it, please like, comment, and share with anyone you feel would love a little bit of history, a little bit of entertainment, and a whole lot of inspiration. And make sure to stick around for the outro because I'm going to mention an aspect of this performer's life I didn't feel worthy enough to make the main script, but I think you should know regardless. And as I always say, just a reminder even though today's subject has a plethora of acting and other experience, we are only focused on the dance. Okay, let's get into it. He was born on July 17th, 1899, on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, in the tenement filled neighborhood around Avenue D and 8th Street. His father, James Francis, tended bar and eventually ran a small saloon. His mother, Carolyn, came from an Irish family and had gone to work in a factory at 12 years old to help support her own mother and siblings. Carolyn was only 20 when she gave birth to him, and he arrived a very sick infant, sick enough that she worried he might not live long enough to be baptized. As a devoted Catholic, that fear was real. She believed that if he died without a proper name, heaven wouldn't take him. He survived, after all, but not all of her children did. Two died in infancy, a loss that hovered over the family in a way no one ever forgot. When he was 2 years old, the family moved to East 79th Street and not long after to East 96th Street. Apartments were cramped, neighborhoods were rough, and poverty shaped nearly everything about daily life. But inside the home, there was music. The piano was always going, and he and his brothers forever fooling with a tune. As a little boy, he'd stand and sing old fashioned love songs for his parents, who would sit together, holding hands, beaming like the summer sun. And another artistic part of him was already emerging too. He loved to sketch whenever he got the chance. Whatever the family lacked, whatever they were up against, that warmth was the constant. As he later put it, the poverty was real, but it never fully occurred to them because the household itself felt full. Work came early for every child, and he was no exception. Still not quite a teenager, he sold programs in armories for 50 cents a night. At 14, he landed his first steady job at the New York Sun, hauling proofs and newspapers to big department stores downtown. By 15, he was working at the New York Public Library, earning $12.50 a month, and later moving to a custodian's job for $17.50. He worked nights at the Lenox East Settlement House, and on Sundays he sold tickets on the Hudson River Day Line. Every hour of his week served the same purpose: to help keep the family afloat. His neighborhoods shaped him too. The streets were filled with Italians, Czechs, Germans, and Jews, and the air was a mix of languages. In school, most of his classmates were Jewish, and as he learned German, he also picked up the Yiddish equivalents from his friends. He once said he didn't meet an older man without an accent until he was 22, because accents were simply the world he grew up in. And it wasn't just the sounds that left their mark, the streets themselves demanded a certain way of moving. Like the men in his family, he was stocky but quick, unexpectedly light on his feet, the kind of kid who could hold his own on crowded streets where you had to move fast or get knocked flat. By 1918, he was studying art at Columbia University in the Student Army Training Corps when the flu epidemic tore through New York. His father, whose heavy drinking had long shaped the rhythm of their home, suddenly fell ill. So he rushed home, only to learn his dad was taken to the hospital so that his mom would be safe from infection. He finds a streetcar and makes it to the hospital not long after, but was immediately confronted with the shocking truth. His father had died that morning. He was only 41, a sunny, charming man who could light up a room, suddenly gone. And overnight, his mother was alone, with another baby on the way and a house full of children depending on her. After his father died, everything in his life narrowed to two things: work and survival. He took whatever jobs he could find, and he kept showing up at the Lenox Hill Settlement House, a place that became something like a second home. He was still working there when his younger brother got sick before a small play and couldn't perform, so he stepped in. Nothing fancy, no spotlight, but it was the first time he ever walked out onto a stage, and something inside him lit up. The settlement house also introduced him to Burton James, a mentor who saw an artistic spark he didn't yet see in himself. He gave him small creative jobs, painting scenery, sketching posters, the kind of work that let his eye for design start sharpening itself in the background. But the moment that actually nudged him toward dance came in the simplest way possible. A kid at the settlement house named Joe Hevron showed him a step. It was called the Peabody, a fast, intricate social dance that, as he put it, was almost impossible to describe. Rumored to have been invented by a Boston cop, it was full of quick turns, tight footwork, and a kind of brisk driving rhythm. And somehow he could do it. He picked it up immediately, and at that point in his life, it was the only dance step he knew, but he knew it cold. He didn't think of it as training. He didn't think of it as a direction. It was just a thing he could do well, tucked in alongside all the other odd jobs and scraps of experience his life had given him so far. But that dance stayed with him. By the time he was working at Wanamaker's, one of the many jobs he bounced between after leaving school, a coworker mentioned that a vaudeville act up at Keith's 81st Street Theater needed someone who could dance a little. That was it. That was the whole pitch. And the only dance step he knew was the Peabody. So he went immediately. The act was called Every Sailor, and the men were exactly that. Phil Dunning, a New York showman and former chief petty officer, had spotted these real Navy guys performing at bases and pulled them straight off the USS George Washington to put them into vaudeville for the war effort. And the act? A full on female impersonation chorus line, six sailors in skirts. One of the quote unquote girls was quitting and they needed a replacement fast, so he auditioned. He showed them the one thing he had, the Peabody, and he was hired on the spot. $35 a week for a kid who had spent his whole life scraping for dimes. That amount was staggering. And here is the part he loved telling for the rest of his life. His first real job in show business was as a chorus girl. And this is where he actually learned to dance. He faked what he didn't know. He stood in the wings and watched the real dancers. He stole steps, bent them, twisted them, reshaped them to fit his body until they became his. He once said, in those days, except for ballet instruction, there were few dancing schools, no place really where one could learn tap dancing. All we ever did was steal from each other, modify the steps to suit ourselves, and in that way develop our individual styles. And so that was his training, just instincts, imitation, and the nerve to keep up. When every sailor eventually folded, he tried a normal job again, a brokerage house on Broad Street, but he hated it. The rhythm of show business was already in his bones, and it kept pulling him back. He made his Broadway debut in a musical called Pitter Patter. He was first cast as a chorus boy, and after the other seven chorus boys were fired, he became a specialty dancer. And from there, he slipped into the world that would make him vaudeville. He spent the next few years bouncing between acts. Some good, some awful, some that didn't survive a single performance, but every job built him. He did comedy sketches, singing turns, specialty dances, anything that kept him moving and earning. Eventually, he landed in a three-person vaudeville act called Parker, Rand, and Leach. The Leach in the title had just left, a young performer named Archie Leach, who the world would later know as Cary Grant. When our guy stepped in to fill the vacancy, the billing changed to match his last name, and the act toured for the better part of 6 months. Money was scarce. After he married, he and his wife, also a dancer, lived in dingy rooms, sometimes with barely any food. But vaudeville hardened him in the best possible way. It shaped how he performed, how he worked, how he thought. He would later describe it simply, saying that outside of his wife, nothing influenced his life more than vaudeville. Those performers, most with no formal schooling, had a raw, electric quality that riveted audiences. And these performers understood something he never forgot. Audiences decide what works, not critics, not management, the people in the seats. Vaudeville taught him to rebound from failure instantly, to judge material honestly, and to hold a stage with total command. It's where he became, in his own words, a vaudevillian, a song and dance man at heart. And from there, the work on Broadway kept coming. In Grand Street Follies, he danced to Noel Coward's music and even played a dancing traffic cop, short moments but real dancing on a New York stage. Then came Maggie the Magnificent and finally Penny Arcade, a gritty little play that lasted only 3 weeks but landed with enough punch to draw the right eyes. Al Jolson, the biggest entertainer in America at the time, a superstar of stage and early sound film, saw Penny Arcade, loved it, and bought the screen rights. He also insisted the two breakout performers in the show be taken with it. Him, the red-haired kid in the lead, and Joan Blondell, the wisecracking, fast-talking comedian who had been stealing scenes on Broadway for years. Warner Brothers sent them both to Hollywood to recreate their roles in the film version, Sinner's Holiday. He went out on a 3-week contract. Nothing guaranteed, nothing fancy, just a chance to work. But the studio kept renewing him. First, another short contract, then something longer. And buried in that long-term deal was a catch he didn't understand at first. Warner Brothers could drop him at the end of any cycle, while he was locked in for years. It was the studio system at its most lopsided, and he was learning it in real time. He jumped from Doorway to Hell to The Millionaire, barely catching his breath between shoots. In his first 40 weeks at the studio, he made roughly 6 pictures. He later said the pace made him feel like one of the Warner racehorses, run hard, then shoved right back into the gate. Then came Public Enemy, the low-budget picture that unexpectedly turned him into a national name. There's a moment in that film that became infamous. His character shoves half a grapefruit into a woman's face at the breakfast table. He later said he didn't think twice about it. The bit came from a real Chicago gangster story the writers had heard. But audiences wouldn't let it go for years. Whenever he walked into a restaurant, some wise guy would send a tray of grapefruit to his table. The movie became a hit. The studio gave him star billing after that, but the pay didn't match the title, and he noticed everything: how actors were treated, how quickly they were replaced, how little any of them mattered to the men running the machine. But even in the middle of the gangster roles and the chaos, dance kept slipping back into view. In Taxi, the script called for a dance contest, and unbelievably, the Peabody. That same odd, intricate step he'd learned back at the settlement house. He knew exactly one person in Hollywood who could match him: George Raft, a fellow New Yorker with real dancing experience who was still new to movies. So he asked for Raft to be brought in as his rival. The scene worked sharp, fast, electric, and for the first time on film, audiences could see what years of vaudeville had carved into him rhythm, attack, and that eccentric, almost improvised style he'd built from stolen steps. The pace at the studio was relentless. He churned through films until he finally landed Footlight Parade, a picture he fought for and one of the few of that era that actually let him dance. He called it pure fantasy. It put dancers to work at a time when many had nothing, and it gave him space to move in a way that gangster films never did. And in one of the big production numbers, he finally got to show what his body could do. He's up on top of a bar, ripping through those sharp, eccentric leg flicks and taps alongside Ruby Keeler. The whole thing becomes a back and forth, a move and match duel. They're side by side, testing each other, pushing each other, and he keeps the whole thing on track with that laser focused gaze he learned in vaudeville. By 1935, he was among the top 10 box office stars in America. Not that he cared. What he did care about was the studio still refusing to pay him fairly. So he walked, sued them, and while waiting for that fight to resolve, he took a job at a much smaller studio, Grand National Pictures. There, he made a musical called Something to Sing About, and for him, it was a gift because it brought him back to two dancers he'd known since vaudeville, Johnny Boyle and Harlan Dixon. Boyle had been one of the dancers he admired early on, someone whose steps he'd watched closely and learned from. Dixon had staged the dances for the film and had been one of the teachers he worked with in New York before his Broadway break. And in one of the film's big numbers, a high energy routine set aboard a ship, the three of them danced together on camera. It was that rare moment where he wasn't imitating anyone or stealing steps from the wings. He was dancing alongside the very men who helped shape the way he moved. When the shoot ended, he slipped back into the grind of studio work, the pace, the contracts, the roles that kept him moving but rarely let him dance. And then came a script no one saw coming. Not for him, anyway. Studios only saw the tough guy, the grit, the fists, the street swagger. But this story, it belonged to legendary Broadway showman George M. Cohan. And as he read, something unexpected happened. It didn't feel foreign. It felt like home, rhythm, timing, stage instinct, the same pulse he'd carried since vaudeville. The script needed work, badly, so he agreed to do it only if the Epstein brothers rewrote the humor. Once they were in, he signed on. The film, of course, was Yankee Doodle Dandy. And the real preparation began. To nail the physical style of Cohan, that stiff legged, forward leaning, quick cut way of moving, he rehearsed with Johnny Boyle, who had actually danced in the Cohan Review of 1916 and knew Cohan's vocabulary firsthand. And once cameras rolled, the dance work hit fast. One of the earliest routines he filmed, I Was Born in Virginia, introduces that tight clipped Cohan rhythm. Brisk footwork, squared shoulders, and the kind of sharp musical phrasing that feels more spoken than sung. It wasn't a full production number, but you can see him locking into the Cohan style for the first time on camera. Then there's the Yankee Doodle Boy. That is the explosion. He launches into it with the heel clicks, the stiff legged runs, the sharp directional changes, the trademark Cohan vocabulary, but filtered through a body that was built on vaudeville rhythm and instinct. There's an energy to it that isn't just mimicry. It's what the New York Times at the time called a faithful characterization, glowing with energy. And the way he hits those pivots, there's a flash of almost balletic lift in moments, the kind of buoyancy you don't expect from someone Hollywood kept calling a tough guy. Even in the small moments, you can see it. His dancing was never about showing off. It was about character. It was personality. It was the rhythm he carried in his bones. But then there's the finale, a moment on the White House staircase. The descent from the president's office. He glides down the stairs as if on a cloud, tap dancing his way down with unbelievable control, lifted posture, quick footwork, effortlessly infusing the intricacy of ballet jumps with those rapid, fluttering tap wing steps. It's precise, coordinated, almost weightless, the kind of sequence that simply takes your breath away. And in the middle of all that work, I just had to mention this, a small full circle moment appeared. His sister, Jean, the same baby their mother had been carrying when their father died, had decided on her own to go into show business. She'd spent 6 months training with Johnny Boyle, and by the time this film was underway, she had quietly built real skill. Wings, cramp rolls, buck dancing, all of it. He didn't always know what she was working on. She kept her career separate from his, but now she was in this cast too, playing Josie Cohan. Two siblings who had started life in chaos were suddenly sharing the same frame. The film was a hit. The performance was undeniable, and the Academy gave him the Oscar for the role that proved what he'd always been, a song and dance man. After the whirlwind of Yankee Doodle Dandy, the work didn't stop, and neither did the dancing. He joined the USO and crossed the Atlantic in 1944 to perform for troops overseas, even on a ship packed with thousands of soldiers under constant threat from Nazi submarines. He was still rehearsing routines, still giving dance lessons on deck, still proving to himself as much as anyone that movement was the thing keeping him alive. He always said dancing was a form of health insurance. Get out of breath twice a day, he'd recommend, never surprised the heart. And even in the middle of war, he taught those fundamentals, showing young paratroopers how rhythm and breath could steady you when nothing else could. After the war, the work expanded into new kinds of musical storytelling. He made the West Point Story in 1950, and behind the lightness of the plot was some of the sharpest, most precise dancing he ever put on film. In one number, It Could Only Happen in Brooklyn, he tap dances his way through an energetic swing-style pas de deux with Virginia Mayo. Footwork clean, timing exact, humor folded right into the choreography, and the number expands to a finish which he later called a lot of hard dancing. We're talking fast, intricate, athletic, acrobatic, and all of it culminates in a knee slide. Actor Gregory Peck, in his early 30s at the time, was watching him from behind the camera. They had to shoot this dance scene an exhausting 5 times, and Peck wondered aloud, my God, how does he do it? But that was the truth of him. The discipline of a hoofer never leaves the body. And 13 years after Yankee Doodle Dandy, he slipped back into playing Cohan one more time for The Seven Little Foys, trading challenge steps with Bob Hope on top of a table. 3 weeks of rehearsal, knees swollen with fluid from an old step he hadn't done in a decade, but he finished the routine without a hint of pain on camera. That was the muscle memory of vaudeville. That was the cost and joy of being a song and dance man. And even into his 70s, when the cameras were long gone, by his choosing, it should be noted, he kept a wooden dance board at home. When he needed to clear his head or keep his heart steady, he went back to the same thing he'd relied on his entire life: rhythm, repetition, sweat, and breath. Because for him, it never changed. Not through the tough guy years, not through the musicals, not through the war, not through age. He wasn't the most technical dancer in Hollywood, and he never pretended to be. But what he had was unmistakable, a style born from instinct, rhythm, and lived experience, sharpened in backstage hallways long before the cameras ever found him. And here is what people forget. He wasn't just a rough around the edges mover. He was a genuinely gifted dancer. There was a clarity to his attack and a musical intelligence in his choices that you simply cannot fake. And because of that, a small but vivid thread of old vaudeville, his thread, didn't vanish when the stages went dark. It lived on through him. It still does. His name, James Cagney. And now you know the rest of the story. All right, Dance fam, you made it to the end. That makes me think you enjoyed the episode. So if you did, please do the things. Like the video, comment, tell me your thoughts down below. Make sure you're subscribed, share this. Before I wrap, there is one piece, like I mentioned in the beginning, that I'd be talking about here. It's a little gem in his dance story that I didn't include in the main script because I couldn't verify it. It's as simple as that, but I think it might deserve a mention here. Now, I did, as I do, a lot of research, and I found some newspaper articles, believe it or not, from 1938. That's a while ago. They said that he studied ballet with Theodore Kozlov. Now, Kozlov was one of the major Russian ballet figures working in Hollywood in the 20s and 30s. He was a very serious teacher, and he wasn't someone you just casually took a class with. And according to these clippings, which if you're watching on the screen, you will see where they are from, Cagney worked with him because he was interested in starring in a film about Nijinsky, the legendary ballet Russe dancer, often considered, and rightly so, one of the greatest male dancers in history. And on paper, the claim could be true. I mean, when you look at Cagney, for example, in Footlight Parade in 1933, and then sometime later, I think in 1937 or 38, when he was in Something to Sing About, a little bit different in his movement, his cleaner posture, lifted carriage, small bursts of allegro that don't appear really in his earlier work that I could see. So it feels to me like something changed. But here's the problem. He never mentions Kozlov in his autobiography, which I read, which was my primary source of reference for this episode. He doesn't mention any of this, not even one time. And without his own words or additional primary sources, I just can't treat that story as fact, because I have a lot of corroboration from a lot of people I've spoken with, dance legends themselves, who've reached out to me from this series and all of it. And I just have learned that way back in the day, it's never really changed. I mean, it's the same today. Things are often fabricated. PR, press, whatever, picks up stories and they run with things, and they're not based on truth. So I left it out of the main narrative. But if it is true, it fills in a fascinating little gap, don't you think? It would explain that his movement maybe did become more refined, and it would add another layer to how seriously he took dance, even when the world mostly saw the tough guy roles. And anyway, I just didn't want to lose that context entirely, so I'm leaving it here as an open possibility. Not confirmed, but not dismissed either, because if it happened, I think it's an important chapter in the evolution of his dancing. And hey, you never know, somebody watching or listening to this podcast at some point may actually know the full story. So if that is you, let me know, and then I'll let everybody else know. Okay, that's all I got. Until next time.